Good afternoon. Welcome to Connecticut's Old State House. I'm really happy to welcome you to today's conversation at noon called the Voting Rights Act, The Struggle Continues. My name is Rebecca Tabor Conover. I'm the head of public programs here at the Old State House, and we're very excited to have you here today on a lovely fall day. On your seat, you'll find a rack card with information about our upcoming November and December conversations at noon. We hope to see you back for that. And in December, join us for our holiday craft fair and do some holiday shopping in December. And last but not least, we have surveys on everyone's chair, and we would appreciate it if you could please fill those out at the end of the program. We have pencils on the back table, and I'd be happy to take any of those surveys. We would like to thank Connecticut Humanities for sponsoring the Conversation at Noon series. Today's program is being filmed and will be broadcast on the Connecticut Network, so you can watch it again or encourage your friends to do so. And it's a pleasure to have so many folks from Connecticut Humanities here today, and we thank them for all of their funding support. And now, without further ado, because I know a lot of folks are on their lunch hour, I am pleased to be able to introduce my colleague, the Connecticut Network's Senior Producer for Program Development, Diane Smith.
Thanks, Rebecca. We're glad to see you all here today. I should say that since we're talking about voting, we also have a special guest. Our Secretary of the State, Denise Merrill, is here, and we'll be calling on her later to add a few points. And the Deputy Secretary, Jamie Spallone, is here as well. But a lot of people have probably just started to tune into the fact that when we go to the polls on November 4th, we will not only be choosing the next governor, all the constitutional officers, and our state legislators, but we will also be faced with a question that's on the ballot. It says, shall the Constitution of the state be amended to remove restrictions concerning absentee ballots and to permit a person to vote without appearing at a polling place on the day of an election? Well, what will be the implications of that? We're going to explore that in a few minutes in our panel discussion, and we invite you to take part in that and to ask questions. We'll bring a mic to you if you just raise your hand. But today we start by commemorating the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. It is generally considered the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever adopted by the United States Congress. The act is meant to ensure that no person shall be denied the right to vote based on race or color. But as we have seen in recent elections, there have been some roadblocks put in the way of potential voters in several states. Here to talk about the struggle for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, its impact, and its current relevance is Dr. Stacey Close. Dr. Close is the Interim Associate Vice President for Equity and Diversity at Eastern Connecticut State University. He is also a professor of history who has taught courses including African American history since 1877, history of the South, and churches and the modern civil rights movement. Please welcome Dr. Stacey Close.
Just want to thank Diane for that very, very nice introduction, and also to Rebecca Tabor Conover and the Old State House for inviting me back again to talk to you for just a few minutes today. I often tell audiences that talks that I give as a old history professor, I am used to 3-hour lectures and classes, but I promise you I don't have a 3-hour talk for you today. What I would like to talk about today is the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the struggle that continues and why it still matters. When this topic came to me, I was trying to figure out how to begin the conversation here with you at the Old State House. Having taught the churches in the modern civil rights movement, I decided to drift back to the days of Lyndon Johnson and his time in office. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to hear any of the recordings of Lyndon Johnson's White House, particularly his conversations with Senator Richard Russell of Georgia when they are talking about and discussing the Civil Rights Act. And very, very interesting conversations that they have, where you have Lyndon Johnson going back and forth, asking for support from Richard Russell on civil rights, and Richard Russell pushing back, saying that he can't support him. And then eventually Johnson deciding to deal with the situation directly and let Richard Russell know that if he doesn't support him, then he will just run him over. And so that was Lyndon Johnson. But for our conversation today, I begin with the legendary civil rights leader, Diane Nash. She was a student leader in Nashville, Tennessee, during the early wave of student activism in Nashville in 1960. She would go on to be a major proponent not only of nonviolence, but also a major leader when it came to activism and students, particularly young people in and around Birmingham, with discussions about how to be more active. She's also featured in part in Spike Lee's Four Little Girls, a wonderful documentary on Birmingham in 1965. It was on September 15th of 1963 that the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham was bombed, and 4 little girls were murdered in the process, and some 30 people were injured by the bombings that had been a constant in Birmingham in 1963. For those 4 little girls who died, Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robinson, and Cynthia Wesley, those murders shook Diane Nash and also the modern civil rights movement to its core. Diane Nash remembered a conversation that she had with her then husband, James Bevel, about what they should do after this horrible bombing. They decided on a course that would prove to be significant for the civil rights movement. Rather than going on a course that sought revenge, they began to focus in on voting, the question of why voting. Voting, Diane Nash argued, would be a way to protect their children. So she argued that the campaign that began to gear up around voting, as far as the activism side, was a campaign to protect children. Now, for African Americans and the issue of the right to vote, it has historically been an ongoing issue, whether you talk about North or South, and I'll spend most of my time on the South. If you go back to the period after the Civil War, the Republican Party, which had won the Civil War, began to advocate for the enfranchisement of free blacks. Part of that reason for the enfranchisement of free blacks, they wanted to make sure that they had a political foothold in the South. Well, how do you do that? You work to get black voters, because very few Southern whites were going to vote for a party that had just gone to war with for 4 years. With the help of military commanders, you began to see a significant change in terms of the South. Part of that significant change dealt with the increased number of military officials who were willing to help blacks begin the process of acquiring the right to vote. What you begin to see during Reconstruction is the election of blacks into national as well as state offices, the election of blacks to the U.S. Senate during the period of Reconstruction. But what you also begin to see is a pushback by Southern white Democrats. That pushback is illustrated in no better place than in Mississippi. White leaders of Mississippi decided that they were going to reclaim Mississippi by 1875. They were going to deal with the Republicans, deal with blacks. They were going to deal with it in a myriad of different ways. They were going to deal with it by using intimidation. They were going to deal with the presence of Republicans by using terror. And they were also going to make sure that for those who were not terrorized, they would find a way to force them to support the Democrats. As far as the tactics that were used politically, there was fraud, there were threats of violence, and there was also economic coercion, as well as violence and terrorized violence as well. In Mississippi, Democrats became concerned because they were engaging in practices, they said, that were a bit too illegal, I guess you might say. So they decided in 1890 to call a convention where they were going to build a new constitution, and it was their goal to control the South without corruption, because in the period of the 1870s, they said there was too much corruption. Well, how do you ensure, as far as the Democrats in Mississippi, that you have a fair campaign in 1890? They decided that there would be a convention with 130 white delegates who were Democrats and also one Republican delegate who was black. And they considered that as equal as possible at the time. In terms of the convention, a Mississippi judge reported that there had been very few fair elections in Mississippi since 1875. He reported that there was a great deal of ballot box stuffing, there was a great deal of perjury, a great deal of fraud, and violence was commonplace. There was no justice and there was no equality in terms of politics of this period. By 1890 in Mississippi, the Constitution was set up so that it would limit black voting power. It would enable whites to have home rule, and they began to institute many of the things that you've heard about in your courses over the years. The literacy test, the poll tax, a 2-year state residency requirement, and also a 1-year precinct resident requirement just to vote in 1890. Now, all of these things were part of a long struggle, particularly for African Americans, to achieve and acquire the right to vote. The numbers, of course, are quite chilling when you look at what happens as these efforts are made to limit and control black voting power. In 1880 in Mississippi, there were some 110,000 whites who were registered voters. There were 130,000 blacks in Mississippi who were registered voters. By 1896, the same year Plessy versus Ferguson, white registration actually dropped to 108,000 in Mississippi. Black registration dropped to 16,234 people. Now, what eventually came after that, to sort of set the stage of this continuing effort to limit black voting, you had white primaries by the early 1900s, which allowed only white Democrats to vote in the primary election, thus establishing who the candidate would be. And that lasted until 1949. By 1954, Mississippi legislators also added requirements for voting. You had to read and understand a portion of the state constitution. And also, by 1960, in order to vote in Mississippi, you had to be a voter of good moral character. And if you were a voter of good moral character, that did not mean that you would not be challenged if you possibly got on the roll if you were black. The names of people who were registered to vote were actually published in the newspaper. And any other good voter of moral character could challenge your character based on their thoughts and views regarding you. As far as registrars, frequently in the 1950s and 60s, registrars who happened to come across blacks who were willing to try to vote, they challenged them with interesting questions. On a visit to Wesleyan University in 1964, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave an example of what registrars sometimes ask blacks in Mississippi. The question was, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? And so, if you were black, no matter the answer, it was always wrong. As far as white voters throughout the South, white voters throughout the South were able to be registered by proxy. If you were black, you had to come down to the polling place and register, pass the literacy test, or also pay your poll tax. What you find is that for blacks who were literate, who could fill out the application, were often left without the right to vote, while whites who had registered by proxy were allowed to vote. Now, as far as the modern civil rights movement, what you begin to find as far as the modern civil rights movement, activists from places like Albany, places like Montgomery and Birmingham, they were on the move and on the march in the 1960s. They were fighting for a common right to have accommodations that were free and equitable. They were also fighting for the right to vote eventually. Now, the voting campaign that would emerge out of Selma in 1965, it was a unique campaign, but it was also a campaign where you saw a cross-section of the modern civil rights movement participating. You saw the clergy from all different denominations and all different walks of life taking a part in the movement. It will be that campaign, along with the work of politicians in Washington, D.C., like Lyndon Johnson, and the legacy of John Kennedy, that will help with the emergence of the Voting Rights Act and its passing. It will be federal officials now who will go down to the South and actually register voters, and they will also observe elections. They will also suspend literacy tests and also require something that's been in the news frequently that we've heard of called pre-clearance. These things would have a dramatic impact on the right to vote for blacks throughout the South. In 1965, for example, in Mississippi, there were 28,500 registered blacks. By 1968, that number had climbed to more than 250,777, a dramatic increase. In fact, by 1968, 59.4% of blacks in Mississippi were registered voters, a dramatic change, and it shows you the impact of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, in terms of the struggle, when we argue that the struggle still continues, part of the reason that we know that the struggle still continues, it still continues because the Voting Rights Act, along with the Civil Rights Act, would help to lead to some dramatic changes in the South. What I mean by dramatic changes, there's this political shift that begins to emerge with the civil rights movement. I'll give you an example. In 1956, when Dwight Eisenhower won the presidency, he lost what we know of as the old Confederate states in the South. If you move forward 8 years, in 1964, Senator Barry Goldwater won those states as a Republican. So there's this growing shift in the South in terms of politics. Now, for young scholars and students who haven't had a chance to take a look at the actual Voting Rights Act and who voted for it in 1965, you can see that voting breaks down on regions. The old Confederate states, the senators, the congressmen are solidly against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It is a coalition of people from outside the old Confederate states of the South that got the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed. It is a coalition of Republicans and a coalition of Democrats, along with activists in the streets, and a very determined president in Lyndon Johnson. Johnson, in terms of politics, usually got what he wanted. He had different ways of doing so, but he would normally get what he wanted in terms of politics. He had the votes to do so. But he also understood that with civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act, when it came to the South, particularly the Deep South, it would be forever shifted in terms of the political climate. Now, as far as the Voting Rights Act, it does open opportunities for African American officials. It also helps to make African Americans the most solid core group of Democratic voters today. And as far as the struggle, and this continuing struggle, it continues because we see now discussions in the news frequently now about voter ID laws and the Supreme Court, the Texas voter ID law and the Supreme Court, the issue of voter fraud versus voter suppression. Recently, we had the lower federal court decision that ruled that Texas voter ID law had discriminated against African Americans and Hispanic Americans. Then, of course, you had the late hour Supreme Court decision that changed all of that, and the famous dissent by Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in terms of dissenting from what she saw as a deliberate way to discriminate against African American and Hispanic voters in Texas. There have also been, of course, the discussions about the Wisconsin voter ID law, which was blocked. There have also been discussions about the issue of early voting in North Carolina, early voting in Ohio, and the Supreme Court limiting and cutting those early voting days. All these things are part of the legacy of the Voting Rights Act. Now, while it's part of the legacy of the Voting Rights Act, it remains still intact, but bent some, one of my colleagues would say, particularly with the recent decision regarding Section 5 and the diluting of the pre-clearance portion of it by the Supreme Court. As far as Congress, though, Congress has an opportunity, some politicians say, to relook at the Voting Rights Act again. Whether it will be done this year is highly unlikely. But there are people in Congress who have been talking about possibly looking at the Voting Rights Act again and working to try to change it. Now, in terms of the still matter part of the Voting Rights Act. Part of the reason the Voting Rights Act still matters has a lot to do with what Diane Nash said in 1965. She was concerned about the children. She was concerned about their future, but it also still matters because there are people in America who will stand in long lines for hours to vote. It also still matters in part because the world is watching the United States. The world is watching the United States, in particular because the U.S. is still considered to be the cradle of justice and freedom in many ways. And it still matters in part because as Americans, when it comes to the stand for voting, one of the things that helps to unite Americans is that the potential to influence politics and the potential to be a true citizen comes in large part with the right to vote. And given that, I will pause here. Thank you.
Our panelists join us now. We have two panelists who are coming up. As I mentioned at the beginning, if anyone wants to make a comment or ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Just take one moment after you raise your hand and I call on you to let Paul get to you with the microphone so that we can hear this when we run this program. So joining us now, in addition to Dr. Close, is Val Ramos. He is the Director of Strategic Alliances and Partnerships at Everyday Democracy. Val focuses on strengthening our nation's democracy through meaningful community change with a focus on racial equity outcomes. Before joining Everyday Democracy, Val served as he worked for the former Secretary of the State, Susan Bysowitz, where he handled constituent outreach and public policy research and legislative affairs, as well as Latino voter outreach. Also joining us today is Dr. Kevin McMahon. He is the John R. Reitmeyer Professor of Political Science at Trinity College. His research examines the presidency and the political origins and consequences of Supreme Court decisions. He's also the author of 2 award-winning books. So let's start with a question that actually I'd like to have all 3 of you make a comment on, and that is the charges that in 2010 and 2011 there were, again, deliberate efforts to try to suppress the vote. And Dr. Close, I'll let you start and we'll just work our way down.
Well, one of the issues, of course, that is rampant around the news airways is the issue of voter suppression. Just this morning, I saw a show where an attorney from the NAACP addressed in part that issue of voter suppression, and she was addressing it based on the Texas case, where she argued that at the lower federal court, they had argued the decision of the case, and no one came forward, she said, to offer any examples of voter suppression in terms of Texas, even though it was argued there has been voter suppression in Texas. What she argued that what was voter fraud, excuse me. What she argued what was happening, excuse me, was voter suppression. She argued that all throughout Texas, some 600,000 people were being impacted by this new voter ID law that is extremely restrictive in terms of her seeing the issue. And so, as far as fraud and voter suppression, it has become a very political issue. You have Republicans arguing for fraud. You have Democrats saying it's an issue of suppression. And you have a lower federal court decision that argued that indeed it was true. And then you have a Supreme Court decision that basically allowed Texas to go ahead with his election with people having to come forward with different forms of ID. And for a lot of people, the attorney for the NAACP said it was going to be very difficult for them to get that ID.
Professor McMahon, I'll call on you next because you and I were discussing before the program began the political strategy behind that. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to have you elaborate on it.
Sure. So, when you're a candidate, there's a pool of voters out there, 18 and over, those who are registered. And what parties try to do is obviously attract a majority of those. But if you decrease the pool of eligible voters, particularly if you think it's lopsided to the advantage of your opponent, then you have a better chance of winning. So this is done through negative ads. It's done through in the opposite, to try to get voter turnout, to get people to the polls, to get your people to the polls, right? So voter suppression is simply a really part of that strategy, right? So if you decrease the number of individuals who are able to participate, you're more likely to win on election day. Going back historically in the South, just going off of the comments that were made earlier, for example, with the poll tax certainly discriminated against blacks. It also discriminated against poor whites, right? So it was just, if you're a poor individual, it's not worth spending $1 to vote. It's better just to stay home on election day. And what this not only enabled was a system of white supremacy in the South, but also a system that advantaged those who had better, higher economic means, right, as opposed to those who were poor.
Val, Dr. Close focused quite a bit on African American voters, but the Voting Rights Act actually also protects other voters, and there's a specific section that I wanted to ask you about, and that's Section 203. Would you explain what that does?
Yes, actually, as a matter of fact, in 1975, the United States Congress recognized that a lot of so-called minority language voters were being discriminated against on the basis of ethnicity and language, limited English proficiency, literacy. And so it adopted Section 203 as part of the Voting Rights Act. And it basically that offers protection so that these so-called minority language voters cannot have access to information, to the ballots, to materials, pamphlets, and all that in their minority language. Mm-hmm. That section actually has had tremendous impact over the years. It has actually allowed for the federal government to monitor and enforce these protections for those groups of voters. I think that one of the challenges that we've seen also with the recent, the Shelby County case is that there was a section of Section 4 that actually protects language minorities as well, Section 4F also, and it actually requires that there be pre-clearance with legislation that impacts those language minorities.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, since one of your areas of expertise is Supreme Court decisions, would you explain to us a little bit about the case Shelby County v. Holder and how it affected the VRA?
Well, it basically goes to this issue of pre-clearance, right? That southern states, which once had to have their voting systems or voting laws cleared by the Justice Department, no longer had to do that, largely because, at least according to the majority opinion, they were using 1965 data, right? And the majority felt that that was no longer acceptable, given the distance of time between when the Voting Rights Act was initially passed and when the decision was made. So it's enabled many of those states that, in the South particularly, but some places in the North as well, to no longer have to have Justice Department approval.
Because beyond those states that are in the South, sometime in the 70s, Alaska, Arizona, and Texas were added to that list. And right. I would ask any of the three of you who have an answer, why those three states?
Those were added in part because of historical discrimination against Hispanics, historical discrimination against Native Americans. Mm-hmm. There are still some concerns now among Native American activists about the changes in terms of gerrymandering districts in the Midwest, and so that's why you have that ruling.
Let's talk a little bit about gerrymandering of districts, because historically it's been used to try to exclude minorities from voting. Today it seems that what we would technically call redistricting, but some people who are more skeptical would call gerrymandering, is actually a way to keep incumbents in Congress, that a Republican seat stays a Republican seat, a Democratic seat stays a Democratic seat. Val?
Well, I think you have to look at it historically also. I mean, there's probably some of that political tactics that are being used by the political parties in some of those jurisdictions, but they do impact nonetheless. The representation of Latino candidates and voting in some of those districts. You know, the carving of the districts is essential when you dilute the district, then you're basically reducing the power of minority voters to do what is called block voting, which is they tend to vote for candidates who are of the same ethnicity and race, and you're diluting that with those kinds of tactics. So it can disguise the reality of discrimination.
Professor McMahon, I think you wanted to say something about that.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, going back historically, and Chief Justice Warren, the great liberal Chief Justice of the 1950s, 1960s, author of Brown versus Board, thought that his most significant opinions were actually the malapportionment decision. So, particularly in the South, much like the U.S. Senate is incredibly malapportioned, right? If you have all of California, over 30 million people, having 2 senators, you have Alaska, which I think is about less than 500,000 people, having 2 senators. And that same model was in existence throughout not only the South, other parts of the country as well. So the very idea of one person, one vote was not a reality until really the post-1965. And then that notion that each person has a right to vote and has a right to speak equally is relatively modern and still doesn't exist when it comes to the U.S. Senate.
Wasn't the development of the House of Representatives and the way that the laws were written to create that, wasn't that meant to overcome the fact that a big state has 2 senators and a small state also has 2 senators?
Yeah, I mean, it's the product of a political compromise, but and would need to have a constitutional amendment to change that. But it is an example of where we are not totally committed as a nation to this notion of one person, one vote. I mean, when it comes to the Senate, when it comes to the Electoral College, right? We still have these some would say antiquated systems of electing individuals to office.
Well, since you mentioned a constitutional amendment, let's get into the constitutional amendment that's on our ballot on November 4th. And Denise Merrill, the Secretary of the State, who oversees the voting in the state, is here to talk a little bit about that. I just wanted to ask you, Madam Secretary, if this amendment is passed, exactly what will it allow?
There is a constitutional amendment on the ballot which will remove restrictions that are currently in the state constitution so that Connecticut could consider things that are already going on in many other states, such as different days of voting, what they call early voting, in person, or expanded opportunities for absentee ballots. And there's every different version of that going on, up to and including Oregon that has mail-in voting. If you voted in the last election, you're mailed a ballot, you fill it out, and you mail it back. And they have very high voter turnout in Oregon. So all those things could be considered should the amendment pass. Nothing would change immediately because the laws are also in statute. So the General Assembly would be able to debate those issues. And I think it's a very important issue in the state because of all the things we've been talking about. In this state, we are sort of proposing expanding voting opportunity, which I think is an important issue for people to think about.
We are one of very few states that does not have extended voting, meaning you don't just show up on election day, you can vote for some period of time before a particular election day.
That's right, and that's because these restrictions are in our state constitution, extremely unusual provision for a state constitution. It's the kind of law that probably belongs in statute so we can change with the times. But that's the reason Connecticut has not instituted any of that.
Professor McMahon, what would you suspect, why is it in our state constitution, do you suppose?
I would imagine that I don't know the history, so I don't have a great answer to that, but I'm sure it was the result of some concern that if you allow legislatures to change voting laws, there's a potential for problems to develop like we've been discussing. Both, probably the concern was driven more by voter suppression as to voter expansion.
Madam Secretary, I just wanted to ask you about, to explain to people who may not know how this eventually ended up on the ballot. This was not just some whim that came up this year. This is a process, and in fact, is a rather complicated process.
Yes, and that's why it's very difficult to change your state constitution. It has to pass, the proposal has to pass the General Assembly by either, if it's 51% of the vote, that's not enough to get it to the finish line, to get on the ballot. It would have to pass a second legislature, a second group of people, which is what happened in this case, with another 51% at least. And then it goes on the ballot so that all the people of the state can vote on it. So it's about a 4-year process to get it on the ballot.
Professor Close, it's interesting to me that it is such a complicated procedure. In a sense, it really makes sense so that the legislators who may just be there for a couple of years don't have the opportunity to make major changes. On the other hand, it seems as though Connecticut is far behind a lot of other states in the way that they vote.
That is true. I know for my relatives who reside in other places, they do the early voting. They are able to vote on days when they aren't working, and it makes it more accommodating. And for my relatives who are a little bit older and who can't get around as much as possible, if they can get out and vote on Saturday, it makes their day much more accepting in terms of their everyday routine.
And actually, when this measure calling for a ballot question went through the state Senate, getting back to your point about strategy, the vote went along party lines. Democrats voted yes, Republicans by and large voted no. Republicans, several of them, said that they were not opposed to no excuse absentee ballot, where you can get, now you have to say why you can't be in town to vote, but that they were concerned that the amendment does not specify exactly what changes will be made in the way we vote. Is that another political strategy?
I think we can now sit in our homes and bank online. We can shop. We can do a lot of things. A lot of times we take polls, like an ESPN poll, who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl or something, right? So we're used to sort of this online activity, and so will there one day come a time when we can, vote online as opposed to going to a polling station, which is, the idea of voting on a Tuesday when most people work in a certain number of hours, some states are more generous with their hours than others, it is very limiting, and there is voter suppression with regard to that basic idea. But, if there's an unknown, and if you're in the minority, you raise concerns, right? What's going to come? You may remember back to 2004, and John Kerry and the Democrats were suspicious of the voting machines in Ohio. So those types of issues come up, right? If you don't know what's actually going to be the legislation.
I just want to ask the Secretary of State one more question. One of the things that comes up all the time is this issue of voter fraud, and yet I believe that when you really go into the statistics, it's not very widespread anywhere in the United States, much less here in Connecticut.
It's extremely rare. Someone said somewhere that you're more likely to be hit by lightning than to be struck by voter fraud. But I think the problem is the term fraud is used to describe a number of different things. And voter fraud, in its truest sense, would be someone either trying to vote twice or not eligible to vote but voting. And this specter has been raised that there's hordes of people, mostly I think they're alluding mostly to illegal aliens, that people who are not undocumented in some way are trying to vote. There's absolutely no evidence that it's true, and time and again when they come up with these studies that try to show that, they come up empty-handed.
Does anyone in the audience have a question they'd like to ask or a comment that they'd like to make? Just raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone. Not at this moment? Okay. Oh, you do? Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry I didn't see you in the back there.
Thank you. Just arrived a couple minutes after the meeting started. But my question is that if the process is so arduous and slow, then how do you keep momentum and motivation to try to change the law and try to get it to a favorable position if the people who are so busy with so many other things, they can forget about something like this because it takes so long for the process to manifest itself?
That's a very good question. Do any of the panelists have a response to that?
For the states who have the early voting or extended hours, I think that actually works extremely well, particularly for college-age youngsters. Because I know when I was in college, I was going to college but also working. And so I couldn't get to the poll at 5, but if the hours were extended to 7, then I could have made it rather than taking time off from work. Because when I was in college, a few hours at work, that's 1 or 2 textbooks for the semester. And so extending those hours, doing souls to the polls, all those things help in the process. Because we want more people involved in the process, because we get better results. We also get better government when more people are involved in the process.
I'd like to ask Secretary of State to also respond to that question. As that gentleman said, if it takes so long to get this on the ballot, how do you keep the momentum going so that you keep moving on with these potential changes in how we vote?
Well, we got it on the ballot. It took us 4 years to do it, and we're still going strong. I think there are people that truly believe that it's a good thing, and they're concerned about the efforts around the country to do the opposite. And so I think it will carry its own momentum, largely because voters like it. They want the convenience. They want to be able to vote more easily. And I've been surprised at how strongly people feel about that. This right to vote is taken very, very seriously by most people, even though the voter turnout sometimes doesn't suggest that. But if you try taking it away, people really get offended by that. So in my experience, what I've seen around the state is that people are very interested in having more opportunities to vote.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any other questions from the audience right now? Yes, can we give Carol the microphone, please?
So if it does pass, then what would be the timeline in the process?
Well, it would be able to be debated as soon as next session of the legislature. Now, there could be no change at all, depends on what they decide. And there's plenty of examples to look at around the country. 35 states are already doing this in one form or another. So, but it could be decided that we don't want to make a change as well. It will be debated, though, I believe, probably the first session. And I'll certainly weigh in with some sort of recommendation. And other groups will as well. There's quite a group of, there's a coalition that has formed to support these changes. And so groups like the League of Women Voters and Common Cause and some other groups have gotten involved. But it could happen as early as the next election, municipal election. It cannot go into place, obviously, for this election.
Thank you. One of the things that people have talked about, and of course this came up recently again, Dr. Close, as you mentioned, Texas and the law on voter ID. Some people say, well, why is it so hard for somebody to get an ID? What kind of an ID do you need? And, why can't people get them?
Well, you have some individuals who are senior citizens who may live in urban areas that don't own a car, so they wouldn't have a driver's license. You have individuals who sometimes don't have birth certificates. I have a large number of people in my family who don't have birth certificates because when they were born, there were no birth certificates being given out. So then you have other issues of cost. You have some IDs that might cost as much as $55. You also have the issue of travel to go get the ID. Sometimes people aren't sure where to go get the ID. And as far as travel, it may be, I think the example in Texas, it may be 3 hours to drive there to get your ID. And that's actually a huge cost. If you think about what $55 can do for you in certain areas. It's not thought of a lot of money, but it can do a lot of things.
Yeah. Val?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to address the impact that this kind of voter ID law has. In Texas, for example, between 600,000 to 800,000 minority voters will be impacted by this law. And most of them are Latino, African American, and for the same reasons that the professor mentioned, economic reasons, but also travel and other. In some cases also because of the fact that some of these, especially in the Latino community in Texas, there's a lot of mobility from one neighborhood to another, and the address, there's issues with address changes, and so that complicates the process for them too.
Professor, Dr. Close talked about some of the things that were used in the past to keep people from voting, things like a poll tax, a literacy test, violence, threats of economic problems. Can you tell us a little bit more about how the Voting Rights Act and whether it has been effective in ending most of that or all of that.
Well, it's not just the Voting Rights Act. I mean, there's a constitutional amendment, there's Supreme Court decisions, but certainly that time period, there's a lot of activity. But certainly in the South, in terms of African Americans living in the South, voter registration goes up dramatically during this time period. So yes, I mean, and I think with regard to the voter ID law, there's a natural, I think. There's an easy way to sell voter ID laws for those governors and legislators who want to. We show our ID for a lot of things, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, if we take out a library book, we have a library card. So there's sort of a natural sense, or I shouldn't say natural, but an easy way to sell it as something that we do commonly. Mm-hmm. But if you require, for example, everyone to have an ID that has their current name, this has a disproportionate impact on women who have been married and have their old driver's license, right? Mm-hmm. So that means you have to go to the DMV, which requires travel and not really the first thing on our list of wanting to do, right? Spend a day at the DMV.
Or places to spend your day.
Exactly. So then it becomes a question, is it really worth it, right? Is it really worth voting if I have to, lose money, lose wages, spend a day waiting? So, I think that's why they can be effective, those types of laws.
Secretary Merrill mentioned earlier about the fact that in some states the argument for having strict voter ID laws is that undocumented residents would actually go and vote and commit fraud. But I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is undocumented, and he said, I would not risk my livelihood. As important as voting is, I would not risk my livelihood to be deported and imprisoned, because there are federal penalties for that. And so people seem to forget that somehow. But that's part of the reality and the myth of why these voter ID laws can be discriminatory but also very ridiculous.
Do we have any questions from the audience? I'm looking all around. Don't want to miss anybody. I had another question about the federal supervision. Now let's talk a little bit about, Dr. Close, I'll start with you. Would you explain what the Voting Rights Act does in terms of what you call pre-clearance and essentially federal oversight of voting procedures in certain states?
What the federal government does in terms of pre-clearance, it will actually take a look at any changes that a state has in terms of voting and voting procedures. And those procedures have to be okayed, given the thumbs up by the Justice Department, and in the recent past, Attorney General Eric Holder. And so it was a way of ensuring that voters weren't discriminated against in the past, because there were some blatant and rampant things that were going on as far as African Americans in the South were concerned in terms of voting. Even if you had the money in some cases to pay your poll tax, for example, you sometimes couldn't find the person to pay the poll tax through the registrar. Mm-hmm. There was an example that I came across where one woman I believe it was in Mississippi or Alabama, had the money to pay her poll tax for 10 years, but she couldn't find the person to pay it to. Mm-hmm. And she just searched and searched, she had her money, and there was no one to accept her poll tax funds. So you have those kinds of things to deal with on a high level in those early period days.
Mm-hmm. Professor McMahon, there's been discussion in that court decision that the states, or at least this county that sued, said that the South is not the way it was when the Voting Rights Act went into effect in 1965, that in fact it's much more fair and equitable and all of that. Yet the government still feels that there are some states that need to be supervised.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's true that the South has improved dramatically. The question is, will things stay that way if you remove the Voting Rights Act, or will they continue to be fair? I mean, sometimes seemingly basic things are designed to change the results of a vote. So switching from, say you have a city and you have districts, say 10 districts for members of a council, right? You change that, you say, no, we're not going to do districts anymore. We're going to now do at-large voting, right? So just 10 individuals, the first 10 who are elected become the 10 council members of the council. Well, if you have a population that's, say, 70% white and 30% black, just to make it easy, and you have a racial divide in terms of the vote, well, you know what the result's going to be. You're going to have 10, the likelihood or the increased likelihood is you're going to have 10 white members of the council and 0 black members, right? So something that's simple, seemingly simple, not problematic, can be, and so the Justice Department would look at things like that and see what the potential result was.
So Val, that gets back to what you were talking about diluting the power of a particular group, whether it's a minority group or what have you, to vote as a bloc.
That's right. It definitely does, and I think that's actually a really good example of what happens. When I talked about block voting, that is actually being proven to be a fact, especially among the Latino community, but in other groups as well. And so any measures like those that tend to limit the ability of those people to vote for a candidate who is from the same ethnicity and race, and obviously, limits the potential, the power of representation. It violates their civil rights as well.
Mm-hmm. Stacey, you mentioned toward the end of your talk that there is a possibility that Congress is going to take another look at the Voting Rights Act, probably not in the next session, but sometime coming up. What do you think their discussion is going to relate to?
Well, one of the things they have to, as far as the Texas case, they have to take a look at the merits of the case. Mm-hmm. The court basically said in terms of Texas that the election can proceed with the voter ID law in place, but the Supreme Court really didn't look at the merits of what was said by the lower federal court. And so I believe they will have to address that, because there will be more lawsuits coming from the other side in terms of these voter ID laws. And so hopefully, maybe not in the too recent future, but hopefully by next year sometime, they'll take a look at it.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, is that appropriate that Congress should re-look at this as opposed to leaving it in the hands of the justices in the Supreme Court?
Sure. I mean, it's legislation that Congress passed in 1965, so it's their domain to review it and to renew it if they so choose. And I think a lot of times, it may take a crisis that arises because of, long lines in Florida like we saw last election, or this current election should be very interesting because there's a possibility, 2 states, Louisiana has a runoff election. Right now it looks like Louisiana will go to a runoff election in December, and then Georgia has the possibility to go to a runoff election in January. And if the control of the Senate is dependent upon either of those 2 races, these are 2 states that were once covered. Certainly Louisiana has a long history of voter suppression tactics like, vote Tuesday, November 11th, right? So something simple like, so flyers are sent out and people think, oh, I vote on the 11th, right? So, I think if something like that, if you have a race that has a great deal of attention, has an impact on the Senate, and something happens, then there's a greater likelihood that Congress would review it.
Do you agree with that, Dr. Close?
I believe so. Congress has that right, as the professor said, to review the policies and the laws that they put in place. And I think the Supreme Court said they had urged them to do so. But with Congress the way it is now, so gridlocked, the chances of it being reviewed with this Congress were pretty remote, I think. But there are people inside Congress who are interested in reviewing the Voting Rights Act and have talked openly about doing so. And so we have some of those champions inside Congress who've made that appeal. And some of those people who are in Congress are actually around in the earlier period in some way when the Voting Rights Act was renewed. So they know about what the process is like in dealing with it.
Do we have any questions? Yes, Carol?
How much of a problem is voter discrimination in Connecticut today? And are you seeing, or is anyone seeing a potential for something coming up that we should all be aware of?
Well, I mean, there is, even in Connecticut this year, discussion about fraud in voting, and there's something that hasn't really been discussed as much except obliquely. The real impact, seems to me, is on voter turnout, because when people think that there's fraud in voting or that their vote isn't being properly counted, it tends to depress turnout. And that's something I haven't heard anybody talk about today, but it may be the most insidious and most subtle result of some of these changes in the law. Frankly, this whole issue took me by surprise. I don't know about anybody else, but it really didn't come up until really after the 2010 election. And suddenly, in like 12 different states, these voter ID laws and other issues about fraud in voting started to come up. And it is, I'm sure it's a political tactic either way, whether you're a Democrat or Republican. It's certainly related to that. But I think it took a lot of us by surprise, because, silly me, I thought this issue was kind of settled after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But, you know, it's clearly not. It's a seesaw. I thought it was very interesting when you talked about the history of this. It has gone up and down over time. Connecticut, you haven't heard so much discussion about it, but I think you're about to, honestly. And I do worry about the impact on the voting public of the discussion.
Val, one of the things that we've talked about in the Civic Health Advisory Council is trying to get more voter turnout, not only across the board, but particularly among young voters, that it seems as though young voters are less, or potential voters are less likely to register and vote. So how do we give young people the incentive? I mean, you know, in my parents' generation, my generation, if I didn't vote, I would never admit that to people, because to me, you vote. On election day, you vote, or you vote by absentee ballot. I would never tell someone, oh, I'm not going to bother to vote. But you hear it all the time now, particularly among millennials who say, you know, why should I bother? How do we incentivize those people to actually turn out and vote?
Well, I think you can do several things. A couple of things that have been proven to be successful is actually engaging them in a conversation about voting and its importance, what impact it can have on issues that relate to their everyday life. And from studies, it has shown that when you engage people like that, they tend to create a sense of understanding, a very deeper understanding of the value of the vote and how it impacts them directly, and they tend to vote more often. But also look at, you know, engage them through different ways, like social media, for example. There is an initiative, in fact, that is being developed in New Hampshire right now. It's called Text Talk Vote. And it's actually allowing groups of young people to talk about the importance of voting and how they can play a role in the political process. And they use text messaging as a way to engage in conversations. And we found that was a platform that was tried with mental health last year, and it's been tried with several campaigns on mental health. And young people are very, there's affinity for them to do that. They really identify with that approach of engaging in these conversations through texting and then small group discussion. So we have to find creative ways to reach out to them and to engage them.
To the two professors, and we'll wrap up with these questions. You're surrounded by young people every day on campus. What's your sense, and Professor Close, I'll start with you, what's your sense of their feeling of civic engagement and their determination to vote?
If you engage students around the issues that are of great concern to them, if you're talking about higher education, the issue of financial aid is huge for young people, and engage them around that issue. And if you can get some of the people who are running for office to your campus to talk about those issues, then you get a better response. You can also engage them about other issues that are of great concern to students, issues of the economy and jobs and what's going to happen when they get out. Those kinds of things strike a spark. But also what's been proven to be true is that if you engage young people early in the process, they become lifelong voters. That can be done by actually bringing the registrars to your campus. I know that benefited me when I was a bit younger, to actually have someone actually be at the school and register us on the spot. People who turned 18, there was someone there from the town to register you right there on the spot. And so that actually has a huge impact, particularly when the person who's registering you, or the people who are registering you, is sort of close to your age. And so you have that important connection.
And also a few years ago, Denise, you remind me what year it was that Connecticut passed a law allowing 17-year-olds to register if they were going to be 18 by election day. And I think that was a great measure, state measure. And I don't know the statistics, maybe you, Denise, would know, but my sense is that there has been an increase in voter registration among 17-year-olds and 18-year-old voters.
We have a question from the back.
I just wonder if part of the problem with turnout and from different demographics is that when you look at the elected officials and the people that are on the top, they don't have a lot of resemblance to the demographics of the state. So when you are trying to engage the electorate and you don't look like the electorate, there's a barrier there. So my thinking is if we engage at the committee level, young people and people from other ethnic groups, and we allow really engagement and not use them. I know the problem is that those that are in power, it's very difficult to give the power away, and they start working on a legacy and engaging those behind them and start giving opportunities to them, then that will trickle down to the rest of the population and they will get engaged. But right now, there's no equity at the Hill, here at the down at the Capitol, when you look at the demographics and you look at the people that are sitting over there. They don't represent the community. Therefore, there's no excitement about being engaged. That's my thinking.
Professor McMahon, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think oftentimes people get engaged on, when they feel it's a very important election. Certainly in 2008, you saw a great deal of excitement around then candidate or Senator Obama. So it is harder in these midterm elections to generate that type of interest. In terms of young people, I think if you only get most of your information from TV ads, many of the ads are very negative, and part of that intent is to not encourage engagement, right? That why should I vote at all? They're both no good, and there's no reason they should be elected to office, right? So if that's the message that's being sent and repeatedly being sent, it's not all that surprising why people stay at home and don't vote.
Something that I just realized, I think someone mentioned about the importance of educating young people, and I think civics education is an important vehicle, and I think one of the things that Connecticut has done well, and to a great extent because of the work of Secretary Merrill when she was in the state legislature, was to institute a civics education mandate. And so one of the things that we're working with a group of civics activists and leaders is to strengthen civics education in Connecticut, to make it more engaging, so that the high school students who take the civics course actually participate in community service, learn more about the issues, and are more engaged with the issues. Because usually when you do that, you find that people then are more motivated to vote. They become better informed voters and they participate more regularly. So that's the connection between civics education and voter participation among youth is very direct.
Yeah.
Well, I think we are about out of time and have to wrap up, but Professor Close, I had to agree with you when you said the earlier you get people involved in the voting process, the more likely you are to have a lifelong voter. I remember when I was growing up in New York City, the lines to get to vote would be very, very long. There was a lot of voter turnout, and you could sometimes stand in line for 2 hours before you had a chance to vote. And my mother took us when we were as young as toddlers in strollers and took us every year with her so that we would understand the importance of voting. And I still can remember the excitement of stepping into the voting booth with her. And I don't know how much that molded, what I think of voting, but it certainly didn't hurt.
Sure. That's
So
right.
I want to thank everybody for being here today. I appreciate everyone's comments and all of your various reactions. Please don't forget to vote on November 4th. And thank you so much.